We're going to close out today's lecture talking about docstrings, and you'll see why in a second. So what are docstrings? Docstrings are how we provide instructions for someone on how to use the code that's written within the particular file. So oftentimes documentation is where you go, kind of online and it explains how to use something. The docstring is provided in the actual function definition. These are not at all a construct of Python. It's not required, but this is a convention that many companies and many people who write Python follow to have code that is self-documenting. What does self-documenting mean? It means that just by looking at the code, you can figure out how it works and what it assumes and kind of how to use it. Without having to really dig into each line of code, it's nice to have a summary of how a particular function works. So these are mandatory in industry for almost all code. And if you come work at Google, you'll see almost all the Python code that's written every function has a docstring, and they describe how the function behaves. So that includes, what are my inputs? What are my outputs? Any weird behavior, and especially any assumptions. Like if you're assuming that a number is being passed in and not a string or something else, that's a nice thing to specify. So this is what they look like. We have it by putting some text inside of triple quotes, comes right after the definition of our function. So we have this def func name. In fact, maybe we can give this a better name than func name. It should probably be like add vals or something like that. I like that name better. So right inside of this add vals here, val1, val2, and here inside of triple quotes, we have first a sentence or a couple of sentences about what the function does. Then we have a section that explains what the parameters are, so what the values are that are being passed in. And finally, we have a section at the end, a line that explains what the return value is. So it's an integer and what it really means. And you'll find this is a fairly short docstring. For more complicated code, we have longer docstrings. So the reason I'm talking about this now is because you might be curious to know, hey, how does image.io actually work? How do these functions work? If I hadn't made this video, how would you know how to use this class? Well, here you can see that each of the functions that we have written has a docstring that explains how to use these functions in the module. So if we read this, it says, okay, read file, add a file path, returns a matrix. Each pixel is a list of 3 integers. Here's an example. Here's some more information about how this works. And here are the parameters. And here's the return value. And this is all you should need to read to be able to use this module, this function in the module. And same thing for write to file. It's a little shorter. It explains it writes to a file, gives you the parameters, file path, image matrix, image format, and it does not return anything. And so I'll go back here and mention, last thing about this is that before I told you that the way you would look up how to use some particular module or some functions in a module by looking at the online documentation. So it was like, okay, random Python library. And it comes up here in the docs. This is the documentation. This is great. But these docstrings are how we make self-documenting code where the code itself is enough. The documentation is in the code, in these docstrings. And actually, oftentimes, the documentation that you see on this website, on this random, on this Python 3 website, python.org, oftentimes this is actually generated from the docstring itself. So it's extracted. They just look at the code and pull out the string that's in the docstring and use that for the documentation. So that's how detailed you want your docstrings to be. And that's where you'll look if you're ever using a new module that you don't really know how to use. You look at the documentation online and you look at the docstrings in the actual file that you've imported.